talk for hours on time, so I do enjoy the sound of my own voice, and I get paid for it, which is a pretty good deal. I'm going to go down the line, and our panelists are going to introduce themselves and tell them a little bit of their experience. Let's start okay.
Hi, my name's Blue. My band is Hello the Future. I am the only person in my band. I put up songs and I put up vlogs, which are video blogs on YouTube. You can find me by typing Hello the Future into Google. And I talk in front of people all the time, at least twice a week, as mandated by my blogging schedule.
I'm Sarah Mitchell. I work at NASA Goddard Space Flight Center just down the road in Greenbelt, Maryland, and I specifically do education and outreach. So I do dozens of trainings and workshops a year and give presentations, lectures, whatever is asked of me, and sort of have to be ready to jump in sometimes on no notice and give very intimidating public talks.
My name's Elaine Corviday, and I do the webcomic Riven Soul. In my former life, I worked for a nonprofit that required me to give presentations at scientific conferences and also to do some public speaking for donors, give presentations to the board, teach classes, and that.
And so, as I've talked to the panelists, and I'm going to tell you guys now, I have a sort of general schedule of what we're going to talk about in here. We're going to start off talking about the general mindset when you're speaking in front of a large crowd, how not to psych yourself out, how to sort of think about the process. We're then going to go into setting up, what you have to do to set up for a speech, and what you can do for speeches where you have very little setup. We'll talk about delivery, basic techniques of delivery. And then we're going to go into the thing everyone fears, what happens when something goes horribly, horribly wrong.
As it inevitably will.
and how to handle that. And talk a little bit about wrap-up after that. I think we'll have 15 minutes at the end for questions, give or take, if anyone has any particular questions. And of course, you are allowed to ask questions anywhere along the way. I know you feel bad interrupting all these people out here, but
That's right.
We're very understanding. The teeming masses are very understanding. So we're going to start off talking a little bit about mindset, the sort of way you think about public speaking. And I have my own opinions, but I'm going to hold those till the end and let our lovely guests give theirs. And we'll start down on the end and work our way across.
Okay, well, I was really bad about psyching myself out when I was like in high school. If I had to get up and give any kind of a presentation in front of, recite a poem or whatever it is, I would always like try to be like the last person. And that gave me even more time to psych myself out. And I finally realized that if I could possibly make it sooner I could talk, then the less time I had to absolutely sit there and get completely terrified. But as I started giving more presentations, like in college and then professionally, and started settling into it, I realized that I didn't really have any tricks, but just doing it gave me some confidence, but also just not dwelling on it. There's a real tendency to I practice it beforehand, but in like the hour or whatever before my talk, when I'm sitting in the audience waiting to give my presentation or whatever, just not thinking about my presentation. Just sitting there and like paying attention to what the other speaker is talking about, or if I'm the first speaker, then on my way in listening to the radio and singing on that, and just not dwelling on it, because I've already done the prep beforehand by giving it at home or to myself or whatever. So the more I thought about it right beforehand, the more psyched out I would get. So that was sort of my way that I got comfortable with it.
I think that's actually very good advice, because the more you overthink it, the more dangerous it is. You are your own worst critic in pretty much everything you do, so you will notice all of your mistakes, for example, but your audience probably won't. And convincing yourself that you don't have to be, you're not delivering the State of the Union, you're not delivering your Academy Award acceptance speech, you're delivering what you do for your day-to-day job. Mistakes are okay. And yeah, I try to just relax beforehand, which isn't always possible. You're sometimes running around doing all those preparations we're going to talk about, but I try not to think specifically about all the things I'm going to do and get caught up in the details of it, because otherwise I feel like that plagues you the whole time you're doing it.
To tag on to what the other speakers have said, I mean, when you're talking in front of someone, you are trying to make a connection with that person. And if you make it about the connection, then you are less likely to be thinking, have I said too many times? Have I wiggled my hands too many times? And that's another thing that we can talk about later. But once you're actually in there, the way I have found that I do not psych myself out is to concentrate on actually what's happening in the room, not what's happening here, but what's happening out there.
So I'm a trainer, so I will speak in bullet points. But yeah, the not psyching yourself out, and there are a couple of ways to think about this. First of all, and this is the big one for me, people don't care how you deliver your speech. They cannot possibly care about that. All they want is information. The only reason you're in this room right now listening to me is you want information. You don't care if I happen to stutter while I give that information, or if I say, or if I move my hands too much or too little. You don't care. The apathy of your audience is unbelievable when you get right down to it, towards what you're actually doing. They're sitting here saying, okay, I'm writing down this and I'm done. They don't care. Also, on top of apathetic, your audience is far more afraid of you than you are of them. Because you really have all the power. Because while you're up here speaking, they're looking at you, and most of the people, you're going to notice, specifically if you're talking in a classroom, everyone sits in the back row. Because they're terrified that you're going to come out to that front row and say, what's the answer to this question, and put them on the spot. You have a lot more power than they do. So when your audience is out there, first apathetic, and if they care at all, they're afraid of you. So you are in this position of power over these people. They aren't going to jump on you if you make a mistake. Your job is to deliver information. That's the only thing you focus on. You deliver information to the other people. That's why they're there. That's what they're there for. You should be focusing on that, not doing the right thing. And the other thing, don't use cue cards. Don't write down your speech and read the speech that you are about to give. That takes all the emotion, everything out of here. This is my notes for this entire speech, and I can barely read them. So I occasionally look down and I say, oh yeah, I have to remember to talk about that, and then I talk about it. Don't use cue cards. Don't get stuck to a script. Just remember you're there to give information to people who don't care how you give it and are a little afraid of you. And it's gonna help a lot. That being said, let's move on to our next topic, how you set up for a speech, how you prepare, both in the classroom and also with your notes and that sort of thing. And I'm going to go reverse order now, if that's okay?
Sure.
And start here.
So how I prepare, depending on the importance of what I have to say. For example, this is important, but it is not such a high level of importance as, for example, the talk I gave about our album ink hardcover for the FDNY Foundation, in which I had to get specific words exactly correct. So for a talk like this, I came into the room with a couple ideas, like 3 major things I hoped to communicate to you today. The first one I've already communicated, so I hope you remember it. It's about what goes on there and not what goes on here. So for that, walking in, 3 things, I didn't have to write it down, I've got them in my brain. For something that is a bit more complicated, like the talk I give at Scientific Victoria or the talk I give for the FDNY Foundation, right? I sat down with my laptop and I wrote everything out that I wanted to say, and I made sure it was all there, and I read it aloud a couple of times, and as I read it aloud, I X'd out parts and X'd out parts and added things to make sure it made sense. And then, after that, I culled out the one main idea from each paragraph and read from that sheet till I had it. And then after that, I put down the paper and didn't look at it at all, and I pretty much had it. Even if the words were not 100% what they were on the first page, I still had it, boom, 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 lined in my head. So those are the 2 different ways I approach sort of speechifying. So there's the sort of big picture, bullet point, done, or the more specific, here are the sentences in order, now I will memorize them by chunking, and now I'm done.
Okay.
Go done.
For me, it really actually depends not only on the importance of it, but also my comfort level with the content. The thing that we find most easily accessible to talk about is usually ourselves, for example. So if it's a panel like this and it's going to be speaking about my experiences, and especially if I don't know what Eric's going to ask me the day before, there's not a lot that I can prepare besides having a few thoughts in mind about what come to mind when I think about public speaking. So having, again, if like Blue has 3 points, I had a couple in mind for each of these things I might want to talk about. They may or may not come up. But frequently I'm asked to talk about things that are more complicated. So I might be giving a talk about how the periodic table of the elements is related to, nuclear fusion in stars. I have to be ready not only for what I'm presenting, but also the questions that are going to come at me and how to approach those, which I'm sure we'll talk about things like that later on. But really just being comfortable with the topic for me is the most important. And there are things that at this point I've given the same general talk, it's different every time, but 10, 20, 30, 40 times, once you've done it, you shouldn't get overconfident where you do no preparation, but it goes from that deep study, looking through my PowerPoint, making notes, making sure I'm prepared, to glancing at it the night before, making sure I really remember the key points, much more distilled notes, maybe no notes at all, and then I've got that comfort level down. And so that's really, there's that piece of the importance, but also that piece of your own comfort level with the topic.
Well, it depends a lot on what, again, my audience would be. So one of the things I did a lot was like doing presentations or teaching classes to volunteers when I worked at the nonprofit. So from that aspect, when I was preparing a class and putting together a class, I would try to think, all right, not only what do I need to tell them, but what was my experience as a volunteer? And that way I could sort of anticipate their questions, but also throw in, oh yeah, when I was learning how to do this, this is what I had a problem with. And that helps put your audience at ease because they're like, oh, this person up here has been through the same thing, so they feel more comfortable asking you questions, for one thing. Like, oh, you're not just, somebody who was born knowing how to do all this stuff somehow. So sort of making yourself approachable if you're doing that sort of a presentation. For my scientific presentations I would do at conferences, it was usually giving a presentation or letting someone look through the PowerPoint, a colleague who had a understanding of what I was doing. What kind of questions did they have? Trying to say, all right, what kind of questions am I going to have? Because this is taking a whole study and usually condensing it down to a 10-minute talk with 5 minutes for questions. It's strictly enforced. You cannot run over that or they will drag you all the way. So how can I condense this? If I really needed to, I would write something down on an index card, no more than like 2 or 3 things, like, okay, I'm having trouble remembering this phrase, or I don't want to forget this. But usually I would never even look at it when I was giving the speech because by the act of writing it down would help fix it in my head.
Absolutely.
So I might glance at it to make sure that I was saying the scientific name correctly or in the right order, but other than that, I would very seldom look at it. So just sort of trying to prepare what audience are you talking to, what kind of questions are they going to be asking you, what kind of information do they need to have from you.
Now, I'm going to approach the same question from a slightly different perspective. Yet again, I'm a corporate trainer. We get paid by individuals to come to the classes, so a lot of it is presenting an aura of intelligence even when you have no idea what's going on. So there's a couple of techniques that I use. First of all, for setup, I always arrive at the classroom early. I walk around the classroom and I always move something in the classroom. I come in and say, I'm going to move this projector a little bit like that. I'm going to move this band. No point to that, except in my head, I'm taking ownership of the classroom. This is my classroom. When people are coming into my classroom, it's like my house. They're coming into my house, so I don't have to be afraid. I own this place. I arranged this place. I set everything up. I always change something in the classroom, even if there is absolutely no good reason it makes the classroom worse, because it's my environment then. So the first thing, you have to get there early, you have to set up, get yourself comfortable in the space, because so much of this anxiety you're feeling is you're going to walk out into a space you're not comfortable with, and you're not going to know. The second thing for notes, I've already mentioned this, I write down very brief notes for my presentation. This is so I can just look at it, and the notes are simplistic reminders for my brain. I've already done the preparation. I have a huge written out thing somewhere else. I've read it several times. I don't bring it to the classroom. I don't have it with me. I have my notes that remind me of the things I'm supposed to talk about. Because yet again, you don't want to have this. So the topic today is talking in public. That's something you don't want to do. So you set up so you have very simple, clear, clean bullet point notes that you can that can remind you, but you communicate via, off the cuff and talking about that. The other thing, I always make sure, when I'm early in the classroom, I make sure I greet everyone that comes in. Now, you can't do that for everyone when you have a huge crowd, but there's...
Like this.
Yeah, like this.
For example.
With this many people, it obviously would be impossible. But there's always a few people who come in early. You greet them, you talk to them, you say, how's it going? Because those become your friends in the crowd. Those become your friends, you know. Hey, I know that dude. We talked about where I lived, you know, and I have that all in my head. So by greeting it, you've got some allies out there by greeting people early, and they are in a better mood also. It's all about setting up an environment that's comfortable for you and also comfortable for your audience. Because your audience, like I said, they're coming in here thinking, I gotta listen to something else. You want them in a good mood, because if you make them your allies, it becomes a lot easier in that.
I'll also say that by talking to people as they come in, especially in a more educational or training setting, you can get hints about them that will actually help you avoid pitfalls later. So if you get an understanding from the very beginning of who they are and what they know and what they don't know, why they're here, if they really don't want to be here, you can begin to learn things about, gosh, I might not say that the same way for an audience where they already know that, or where they don't want to be here, and so it's great to get that it's a little hint while still being friendly and developing rapport.
Any other comments? Questions out there, guys?
So what you do in a situation where you're giving with the new technology and media out there, a lot of times you're giving a presentation where you can't see the audience, such as if it's a YouTube video, if it's a webinar, if it's even just like a phone conference with an audience or executive.
Well, we'll get to the techniques, but I mean, I find that easier because then you're just talking to yourself, you know, unless you fear insanity.
It really depends. There are opportunities with some of those to have a few people in the room, which I think sometimes does help, especially, like, for example, there's a camera in the back of the room. I'm not looking at it, but if I were presenting this for a webinar, I might be very fixated on speaking to that camera, and I might need someone to go be there where that camera is to keep me focused, so I'm not looking at you when I really should be. But
yeah, and it looks unnatural too if you're staying up here staring straight at the camera the whole time. Yeah, having a couple of people just to give you a slightly different focal point, so you're not standing there like a robot the whole time. That's the biggest pitfall I've found.
Well, and you also need to develop, unfortunately, as time-consuming as it is, different techniques for different types of new media. If I'm doing a YouTube video, for example, my technique is to keep talking and not shut up. If I'm doing a Ustream or a blog TV, I need to pause at certain intervals, catch up what's going on in the chat, respond to the chat, and then get back to my program. And I also need to be watching the chat with one eye, so I'd better have what I'm going to say pretty down pat. If you're doing a conference call, especially if cell phones are involved, you know how the cell phone lag? You got to pause all the time to make sure that people are jumping in and have the opportunity to communicate what they need to communicate as well. Anyway, I'm done.
Yeah, the timing is important, knowing the time that you have to give people. If you're expecting people to talk to you, you have to give them the space. And it is often a lot more space than you think you have to give. Let's just get into techniques and tricks at this point. And since we're already talking about it, and I'm going to start off talking about timing, and then we can just go to other things. I mean, timing is so important for the lecture, and the problem with lectures is the time that's happening up here in your head is nothing compared to out there in the room. Because when you take a pause like this, that seems like just a second to you guys. That was an eternity of agony in my head, where I'm going, too much space. So you've got to get used to giving pauses and giving space. And when you're asking for input, you have to really make that space. Any questions out there? And then you sit for 5 eternal seconds waiting for someone to say something. And after that, you go, and I count in my head, I go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, fine, I can move.
it's easy to get into that. Any questions? Okay.
Yeah. So, other tricks?
Timing, particularly if you're going to be talking in front of someone live or in a classroom type environment, because I used to teach back in the day, what I found is that humans are like computers. after 15 minutes of inactivity, they fall asleep. So my challenge is to always find something, whether it's breaking for questions, whether it's getting up, walking down, whether it's interacting with the people in some way that can happen every 15 minutes. By the way, that is the second of the 3 things I hope to communicate you today.
She's on point.
There we go.
I've got a couple actually. One, I was going to say it in some of the early stuff about preparation. There are a lot of things out there people will put about proper ways to go into public speaking. I read through them, but I don't tend to adopt those tricks. I look at them and assess them and whether I want them or not. And what works for any one of us may not work for anyone else. For example, I never ever imagine people in their underwear. It's likely to do a number of different things. It's creepy. It's creepy for everyone involved. It doesn't actually help with anything. It mostly just has you going, huh, which is not really where you want to be.
Yeah.
So don't do that. But the big one for me is I go to a lot of scientific presentations and a lot of scientific conferences, and so I wanted to talk for a moment about PowerPoint.
Oh, yes.
Oh, God.
Oh, yes.
Or Keynote, or whatever floats your boat. Because this also works down to things like timing and good content delivery. And I will not say that you should never ever use it or you should always use it. You should use it when it's appropriate and you should use it carefully. These are very powerful technologies for communicating information. They're also very easy to rely on as a crutch or very easy to basically use as a presentation you read out loud. And if any of you took that class in school where the instructor opened the book and read it to you, and you thought, I could just go home and read this book to myself faster and in a more comfortable location, that's what I find with PowerPoint, is I attend ones where someone puts up a slide with 1 million words on it and proceeds to read them all to me, verbatim. And then I think, could you have just put this up on, some sort of server? I could have downloaded it. It would have been the same content delivery. So I tend to look at things like PowerPoint as being a very helpful tool, also in preparation time, because I can use that as a piece of my notes, but I aim for very few words on slides. I aim for graphics that will not only be interesting to the public, but also that will jog my memory. It's great when the graphic also, I was going to tell you about that. Okay, let me talk about that.
Yeah.
That's it's even nicer than a word on a piece of paper. It's a pretty picture you get to look at while you think about what you're going to talk about. And so a big piece of it for me is, look at what you like and what you don't like when other people give presentations, especially when it comes to things like their PowerPoint or their presentation style, and learn from it. And don't duplicate their mistakes, which is how a lot of teaching happens, where people just teach the way they were taught even though they hated it, and I don't get that.
Yeah. Your audience has the ability to read. You may not believe that, but
In general, they do.
Generally, they do.
So when you put something on a PowerPoint presentation or up on a screen or on a board, they've read it.
Yeah.
You don't need to actually say what's up there. You're going to add to it.
Unless you put it in a tiny font, which is another mistake.
Oh,
And if you
God.
put it in tiny
Please
font,
don't.
or
We could talk about bad PowerPoints for
well, I don't want to,
another hour.
but I will say, I'm giving a talk in the smaller panel room, it's much
Yeah.
smaller than this. The projector screen was one of these whiteboards, and everything was suddenly this big as opposed to a big one. We were showing web pages, and I knew people would not be able to read what was up on the screen, so I could not rely on the words that were up there, which changes the game. And you do have to be ready to then read them a URL or read them a piece of information, but you hopefully won't have that.
My big tip is people love to look at pictures of people or animals.
Yeah.
And hopefully that will in some way be relevant to your talk. I mean, it should be, obviously. But if you're doing, I was really lucky. I was in the field of wildlife biology. So even when I was doing scientific, I would have, like a data number up there. Not a table.
Mm-hmm.
Do not ever do a table. But, put like a number or bullet point or whatever, but have to the side of that, so it's not just this number or this bullet point on a blank, field. I would put a picture of one of my papers I wrote was on barred owls.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd have a picture of a barred owl there. Or if I was talking about their nesting habits, I would have, the information and also a graphic, to the side of some babies or something. And that actually, that sounds really cheap, but it keeps people engaged in a way that just putting up numbers and words won't. So if there's any, if it's relevant to put in a picture of somebody, a person doing something that you're talking about, or, if you're talking about animals, then you've got your golden, because that will keep your audience's attention on you, boom, like nothing else.
I recommend lolcats, a lot of lolcats. I'm actually not kidding. I
No,
recommend
that's
humor.
actually a good
And so
point,
if
yep.
there's a comic strip or a funny picture
Yep.
that you can include in your talk, I have been known to throw in all sorts of I can has cheeseburger stuff into
Yep.
scientific talks, if it's appropriate for the audience, because they make science jokes. So for example, Schrodinger's cat jokes abound. But if you're really talking about something that relates to Schrodinger's cat, why would you pass up the opportunity to put a lolcat in there?
Yeah.
You get a good chuckle, it adds to the rapport.
Yeah, it
but
puts your audience at ease,
Mhm.
and they are thinking more positively about you, so they're
Yep.
going to rate your talk better.
Your audience is never too mature for jokes.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
You never have an audience that wouldn't appreciate some humor.
Mhm.
And the more humor you can get in there, the more engaged they are going to be in the talk. Humor is essential, and just making fun of everything that happens. Make fun of yourself.
Mhm.
You know, you are a comedian, you're entertaining up there because you're going to be talking about something that's dull, you know? And I mean, no one ever says, we're going to talk about really exciting things and we need a professional speaker up there. No, you're going to be asked to be talked about the most boring stuff that you don't care about, they don't care about. You're both being forced into the room because you're both receiving a paycheck for something. And you have to do it, but no one really cares. So humor is going to get you through that, you know, because it's a very dry subject, and it's going to keep your audience engaged, and it's going to lighten the mood for you. Because, you know, they say humor is important for the audience. Feeling the
Really
Mm-hmm.
freedom
important for the
to
speaker.
just be silly, you know, and joke is going to get you in a much looser mood, and it's going to get you much more engaged. Other techniques that I'm going to talk about real quick, and would you mind assisting me?
Of
Do you have a
course.
cup?
Ah.
The real cute trick, anytime you are stumped on something, have a cup, take a drink.
Probably of water or coffee.
Water, and you've also got glasses. The other great technique I wish I had, take the
yes.
glasses off, fold them up, while you're
sorry,
desperately
wrong cue.
trying to figure out what the heck you're going to say next, and then you can open them up and put it back on. You got another pause there. And you're doing this movie, and it seems cheap, but it works. The number of times I've had my bottle of water and someone asks me something, oh shoot, I don't know that. And I take a drink of water, put it down slowly, take a breath. The answer to your question is I don't know right now. Because that's the other trick, is always have your deflection method prepared and practice. When someone asks you something you don't know, that's the thing you know. How do you do this? Well, I don't have the answer for that right now, but I can look it up to you and we can talk after class about that.
That was outside the scope of my study.
Yeah, that.
That's, if
And-
you're doing a scientific, just,
Yeah.
that's a catch-all.
But it
Outside
is.
scope of my
It is.
study.
People ask me questions where
Yeah.
I'm thinking, okay, that's something that you do after you get your PhD. I don't know. Don't be afraid to say you don't know. That's a
Yeah.
big one. When I go to talks and I think people are they're just going to give an answer regardless of whether it's right or not, that's scary to me, especially in science. I am quick to say, I don't know the answer to that, but it is always good to be able to say, but we could look that up, or here's where you could find that.
That would be good for a follow-up
Mhm.
study. Or,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And have those practiced.
Yes.
The thing you should practice the most about your talk is not your talk. It's how to deal with assholes that are going to put you on the spot. That's the thing you're going to practice, is how to say I don't know in several different ways, how to say that's not really related in different ways,
Yeah.
how to say shut up politely.
Which is a very hard one.
Yeah.
Let's give someone else the chance to speak.
Yeah.
Some of those they're really awkward, and you know
Yeah.
that they know you just basically said shut up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, the trick I have for that is because you can walk around, is you continue talking as you're walking
Yep.
up. You're walking, you know, and as we see in this lecture here, we're talking about how to do this. And then going back into the talk. Because, sorry about that. Because that doesn't embarrass the person.
What
Yeah.
did you whisper?
My TV down.
Ah.
You know, because everyone knows that I just went and told that person to shut up. And the person who was told, they heard it, but it's not publicly shaming them. Because I could have said anything. I could have said, I really like your shirt, you know, or That would be a bad way to do it.
I've had some where that was a temptation. Sometimes just standing next to
Yes.
someone who's causing trouble is enough.
Yes.
And I'm a walker
Yeah.
and talker.
Yes.
We have a sort of an idea when we do education that there's no front to my classroom.
Yeah.
Rooms like this are very challenging, but especially when you've got a more open setting, I'll just wander.
Oh, yeah.
And then maybe I see different people, I make eye contact with different people, I'm not putting the same people on the spot. And sometimes, especially when you're working with people who are very self-conscious about what's going on, just standing next to them makes them stop doing bad things.
Yes.
So you stand next to them and they're texting and then they're not texting. And it's like,
Move
well,
around.
I did that just by standing next, which is what they fear you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But while you're being humorous.
Move around the room. I have taught classes from the back of the classroom because there have been
Yep.
the back of the classroom. There's always the troublemakers who are not going to pay attention, so you just stand back there for the entire bloody class, sitting next to them, giving the class, but you have to stand next to them. And if the first thing you do is stand next to them, if that doesn't do it, you whisper to them, and that's going to shut most people up. So let's talk about, do you have other techniques or do you want to move on to problems when things go wrong?
Problems are so much fun.
Yeah. Do you guys have any questions on techniques or tricks, anything that we've done?
Or anything to add.
Yeah, that's fine. What?
Oh.
Oh, I hate those people. Sadly, shotguns are not allowed. No. My technique for that, when someone comes in here and says they feel that they know, you acknowledge their knowledge. You go, that's an excellent point, and then you expand upon every single point that they make. Well, technically, it's this, and you say, that's an excellent point. Why saying this, we mean, and then you explain the thing that they just explained, even though it's clear what they said. That's the idea of sort of taking control. They want to be acknowledged that they're smart. So you do that. There's nothing wrong with saying, you're an incredibly smart person and you know everything. But this is still my classroom, so everything you're going to say is going to come through me. And that's sort of my technique.
It really depends on what I'm teaching and exactly the disparity between the experts and the non-experts in the audience. Sometimes I teach groups in science who have got a PhD in there, as well as people who are not even comfortable with science. And I will sometimes talk ahead of time to the PhDs privately to make sure that they understand what we're going to be doing here, especially in group work, because I do a lot of group activity things. I don't want them to run their group or give all the answers, so I can usually tell when I go over there in the group, that's the group that has tachyons and antimatter in their picture they're drawing. When everyone else is going, I've got the sun and the earth, and I'm thinking, okay, the PhD is leading it. But sometimes it is worth having a conversation if you know ahead of time that that's going to be a situation. It depends on how much you know in advance. But yeah, absolutely acknowledge that they're there. I never would dismiss that I'm sitting there thinking, I don't want to get this wrong because there are PhDs out there watching me.
When someone thinks they're smarter, give it to them. Give it to them, compliment them multiple times about how smart they are, they'll shut up. Because that's all they want. They want to come in here and they want you to know that they're smarter than you. And I don't care, I just want a class to run fine. I don't care how smart I am. I just want the class to run, so I will give them that.
If you don't give it to them, you risk them challenging you continuously, and that is actually one of the scariest things to have when they want to nitpick everything you say, they want to negate things that you say, and basically they're going to steal your power and your control and your authority by doing that. So the more, in a sense, the more you can pacify people to avoid them doing things to deliberately undermine you, the better you're going to be.
Because you're not going to convince them. They've already decided that they know more about this than you do, and nothing you say is going to convince them otherwise.
Okay.
So you might as well acknowledge them and try to work with them,
Yeah.
make them feel good, because you're not going to change their opinion.
Yeah, and that's hard because you hate them.
Yeah, it's real hard.
and you have to compliment and kiss the shoes of this person who is making your life miserable just so they'll shut up. So you do hate them, but you gotta go, that's a really good point. Yeah, you really know this subject well. That's something I wasn't gonna bring up in this class, but that is a good point. And you say, oh, that's that's way beyond what we're talking about here, but that's an excellent point, and all the time time you're thinking, if I get you alone in a room, you're dead.
I will also say something in the tips and tricks that has helped a lot when you're struggling with the answer to a question or dealing with people, especially in a big group. Having someone else as your partner in crime is very valuable. Anytime you can buddy up, I will just point at her. That's my buddy on most training things. So she's not up here protecting me this time, but it's very nice to know that she can help answer questions. She can be standing ominously next to people when there's a problem. She can solve problems for me while I'm talking. And things like that, especially, I'd say especially when you're new, but I've been doing this for almost 9 years and still enjoy having a second person, especially when I'm running a 2-day, 14-hour training. I don't know how I would do it without the other Sarah. We both are Sarah. It's convenient. We just answer to, hey, Sarah. But that is another thing, especially when dealing with problems. Solving problems, 2 people are even better than 1. 4 people are even better than 2.
Other questions?
How about people, not the ones who are trying to be subject matter experts in their talk, but ones who are just way too important to average to really be engaged?
I let them go. Personally, if they are too important to be engaged, let them type on their BlackBerry, let them doodle. If they're being forced to sit in the room, they're sitting in the room. As long as they're not making a problem, that's fine. Now, the big problem you run into is the guy who came to your lecture for one thing. You're going to talk about 5 topics, so he doesn't care about the first 4. He is there for the 5th topic and wants to move you along.
Yeah.
That's the tough one. The ones who just say, I'm checking out, the nice thing is about most of your public speaking you do as an adult, you don't care. It's not your problem. They don't learn anything. If you're a high school teacher, you have to really, high school teaching is hard because you have to really care about people who don't want to learn anything. As an adult, someone doesn't learn anything, their problem.
I'll contest that, and that I do care. I mean, I care, first of all, personally. Watching someone check out is very painful for me because I wonder what could I have done differently or better to deal with why that person is texting or falling asleep or chatting with their neighbor, which becomes disruptive, and there is a risk of disruption. But there are times when you are obligated to deliver content that people do get, and for the things I do, for example, it's a thing that someone has to complete to qualify for something, and in a sense, if they can't pass the quiz at the end of it, they don't get the prize. Basically, they don't get that certification. So there is a problem where if I end up with, say, 40% of people that aren't getting that certification, there is a point of personal and professional failure that I want to make sure that I try to keep people from checking out. But
the people who come in with the attitude,
you can't always.
I'm too important.
Yeah, that's it.
If you've got half your class checking out, the problem is with you.
Mm-hmm.
If you've got one guy checking out, that's his problem. You're not there to live his life.
And I mean, I cared about it when I was doing volunteer training. If I'm doing a talk in front of, a scientific, presentation, a lot of people may not be there for my talk. They're there for the next one or whatever, and they're just, that's fine. The problem that I would, when I had to try to address that, would be if I was doing volunteer training, and these were volunteers that if they didn't pick up the techniques and were able to do them, then an animal could get injured or killed, from being captured incorrectly or whatever. So that was, and usually, these people were there because they were really excited. And the only thing I can really think of when nothing I did worked was this one person who wanted to just sit there and look at the training materials and read along, which was fine. She'd just done that, but then she would totally check out on me, but then she would stop and ask a question about something I had just told the class. And she did that over and over again. I tried standing beside her or asking her questions or trying to get her engaged so she would stop that. I really was this close to strangling her.
Yeah. Those people are what your breaks are for.
Yes.
You take a break, you walk up to them, and you very clearly say, look, you've got to pay attention to this class. If you're not going to pay attention, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. And you have to be that clear to them. I had a guy in a class, and I wanted to kill this guy. He had narcolepsy or something, because I would give a lesson. At the end of the lesson, I would say, okay, and that concludes what we talked about. That would wake him up. And he'd go, wait, what was that? I would have to go back to him. I'd say, you click here, here, here. Oh, thank you. I'd walk up to the front of the class. Literally, it would take me 10 seconds up to the front of the class, turn around, he was out like a light for the next lesson.
Yep.
And I had to go to him and I said, look, you're really not focusing here and you're not getting anything out of it. And I'm going to have to ask you to leave today. I'm sorry. And so the people who are being disruptive and not checking in, you ask them to leave. You say, because the good of the class is more important than one individual student. There is a point where you have to say, I let this one person go, because the rest of the class is going to be disrupted by it. So here's a question I have for the audience. What happens when something catastrophic happens? Something falls down, a projector doesn't work, your display doesn't work, the thing you were going to give a lecture on doesn't work. How do you deal with that?
I recommend mass hysteria. Freak out. Keep calm and carry on. I think that's really, that's
Try to
completely.
do, there's, when I was giving my honors research presentation as an undergrad, the projector that we rented died, and it was like Friday afternoon, and everybody was gone who like knew how to get a new projector or fix the old projector. So here's this thing that my grade is writing on, and I'm standing up in front of my committee and supposed to be giving this talk, and I can't even bring up the PowerPoint. So I was like, all right, what do I have? Well, I've got, a whiteboard, so I'm going to try to do my, and I have my paper, so before, I give me 5 minutes, and wrote down real quick stuff on my paper so I wasn't interrupting my talk to get, okay, what was that statistic again? Wrote down the things that I remembered putting on the PowerPoint, but you just make do as best you can. It was not the greatest, talk I'd ever given, but I got an A, so.
My opinion is nothing ever happens in the classroom that you did not plan. And whatever it is, even if there was no possible way that you could have planned that, if a guy in a Godzilla costume and a Super Mario costume came in and started fighting in the back of the classroom right now,
Right on time.
that would be that would be a demonstration for me.
Proves my point.
But you have the attitude, nothing happens that you have not planned. And even though that does seem a little bit delusional, that's what you actually are trying to do. You're trying to induce a delusion on the class that you control everything, And so when something falls down, you can make a joke about it. If something noisy is happening, the best technique is to act as if you don't hear the noise at all. A jackhammer going off next to it, you don't hear that noise. And if someone else, because if you act like you don't hear that noise, other people aren't going to say or react to it because they're going to think, is it just me hearing all that jackhammer? And you produce these sort of collective delusions that everything is running smoothly, even though this wasn't supposed to happen at all. So if a projector breaks, you say, now that we've done with our computer part of this, I'm going to go up to the board and give you a demonstration on the board, because we've just finished with using the computer for today. The bulb didn't blow out. I had this planned right away. Everything happens in the classroom that you have planned.
To tag on to that, I used to work at the Illinois Shakespeare Festival, which is an outdoor theater. I used to work at a lot of places, some of them I've told you about, but I used to work at the Illinois Shakespeare Festival, and it was near the Bloomington Normal Airport. So we established from the very beginning, from the first day of rehearsals outside, that when a plane takes off, you just stop talking. As soon as the noise has faded away, you begin talking again. So of course, not to borrow the cliche Shakespeare, it was to be or not to be, that is the question. And the audience actually went with it because they knew that was just what it was going to have to be, and it helped them because they didn't miss anything. To also jump off of what you said about nothing happens in the classroom that you do not plan. I would add do not control. I mean, if something explodes, let's just take a moment and acknowledge that it exploded, and then we move on. But the idea, again, that you have come in not with a tool necessarily, not with I'm going to present you this information with this projector. It's just I'm going to present you this information. No matter what happens, we're going to do it. Cool.
I think sometimes things are catastrophic enough that I haven't had anything quite explode, but I've had some ones where there was no getting around the fact that it was out of my control. I mean, I'm not quite delusional enough, as Eric might be, to pretend it was under my control. But also, audiences, if you've developed the right rapport, are sympathetic. And so I won't say prey upon their sympathies, but develop an understanding. Humor helps. The other one would be discovering the understanding that catastrophic things happen to everyone, especially when I'm training people who teach others. They think it's kind of hilarious in a sense that this is happening to me just like it would happen to them. So Sarah and I were presenting a workshop last December where we had rented a room about this size for 35 people to be in at big tables comfortably for 3 days. And after day one, someone came in and said, "So when are you done with the room?" And we shrunk down to half the room while 30 armed federal agents took the other half, so we weren't going to challenge them for it. And we just came in the neck. We did what we could, made the whole room half the size. It was horrifying. And I thought, these people are going to slaughter us when we come in the next day because they're all going to be crammed in, shoulder to shoulder, miserable, and they've seen what the beautiful world was the day before. I wasn't going to pretend that we'd intentionally done this to make them all best friends. But we came in and we said, this is what happened. You know, we're going to do our best. Tell us what we can do to accommodate you. We know this happens to you guys. And they all had their stories of when the same things had happened to them. And all of a sudden, we'd actually bonded over this horrible thing that had me in tears the night before because I can't always just stay calm. And there is that sympathetic thing where if you've developed the right rapport, they're not just going to coldly look at you like, why'd you let this happen? They're going to probably get a little kick out of it, which you have to accept, because if you can't get a little kick out of it, I mean, we could look back. We're laughing about it right now. It was pretty hilarious in a horrible way. But it helped to have sympathy, and they could definitely understand it.
The number of times I've said, and then you click here, which causes your computer to crash, and will take 2 minutes to reboot, so we're going on break.
Yeah.
Acknowledge it, you know,
That's
they
right.
can see, but...
And everybody has their computer crash. So
Oh, yeah.
if you keep a good mood about it, make a joke out of it, people are like, oh yeah, that happens to me all the time. And it can actually, you know, like you're saying, it can actually kind of help with your rapport.
Yeah. It makes you human,
Yeah.
which it's good to have power, but it's also good to be a human being and not just be a presenting robot who is up here to teach you about the thing.
Any last questions before we wrap up here? Well, guys, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd like to thank our panelists.